afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the fourth in a 5-series webinar on global challenges and COVID vaccine. My name is Kersley Stewart. I'm faculty member here at the Duke Global Health Institute, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to open this series and this webinar this afternoon, this evening. I'd just like to take a brief 1 or 2 minutes to open, and then I'll hand over to our moderator, Dr. Matthew Johnson. Today is the fourth and fifth of a 5-part series on global challenges in the COVID vaccine. Today's series is on manufacturing and supply. I'd like to direct your attention to the previous 3 webinars, which are all available through the Duke Global Health Institute website. The Race for Vaccine Equity was our first one in January. Then in February, we had Overcoming Vaccine Hesitancy. In March, last month, we had What's the Price Tag and Who Will Pay? Obviously, today is Manufacturing and Supply, and our 5th is next month, May 18th, COVID Vaccines in Africa, Issues and Challenges. Just a minute about housekeeping this morning. There is a chat box. I'll be moderating the chat box, so please do post your questions there, and I will curate them and share them with the speakers. We have set aside time at the end of the hour for Q&A. We're also recording this, and in 24 to 48 hours, if you registered, you'll receive a second follow-up email with the link to the YouTube video, or you can also find the recording underneath the COVID vaccine webinar series at the Duke Global Health Institute website. And then after that, this brief introduction, I'd just like to share a few words to introduce our moderator and hand it over to Matt. So Dr. Matthew Johnson heads the current Good Manufacturing Practice organization at the Duke Human Virus Institute. And the goal there at DHVI is to accelerate the delivery of novel therapies of phase 1 clinical trials following good manufacturing practice. He's also the PI, the principal investigator of vaccine manufacturing and toxicology. He's the PI there of that core for an NIH-sponsored collaborative influenza vaccine innovation center. He also oversees process development and current good manufacturing practice of vaccine candidates, mostly related to HIV, and leads the development efforts for the Gates Duke Human Vaccine Institute protein production facility. So Dr. Johnson is really well positioned to lead us in this conversation on COVID vaccine manufacturing and supply, and I'll hand over to Dr. Johnson. Matt?
Thanks, Carrie, for the introduction. So let me first make sure that I can pull up our slides. Can all of you see this? So thank you for the introduction, Carrie, and thank you to the fellow panelists for investing your time and your expertise in our seminar this morning. So in this session, we're going to aim to focus on a crucial area in our current pandemic, which is the manufacturing and supply of COVID-19 vaccines. So as Carrie had mentioned, the format is going to be, we're going to aim for about 45 minutes or so to go through our areas of focus. And then we're going to hold time at the end for questions. And please use the chat function for that. And as Carrie mentioned, we'll collect those and go through them and try to answer them as best we can. So today's panelists, we have a great lineup of experts from different areas of the vaccine manufacturing and supply arena. The first is going to be Dr. Krishna Prasad, who's an adjunct faculty member at the Duke Human Vaccine Institute, and is also the founder of Citranvi Biosciences. He is going to be leveraging his experience, over 3 decades of experience, to walk us through the pros and cons of the different technology platforms that we're all seeing today emerge within the vaccine supply field, and also to talk about the unique features of each of those technologies. Arti Rai is joining us from the Center for Innovation Policy at the Duke Law School. and will lead us in a review of the intellectual property landscape related to developing COVID-19 vaccines, and also how this could impact us and our ability to share and learn in these areas and spread the benefits more broadly. Andrea Taylor is the Assistant Director at the Duke Global Health Innovation Center, and she's going to share her insights that she's gained during her research efforts on looking at the global procurement, manufacturing, and supply landscape for COVID-19 vaccines. And then Dr. Morena Makwana joins us from Cape Town, South Africa. So thank you again for joining us in an off hour for yourself. And he's the CEO of BioVac, which is an organization which builds regional vaccine manufacturing capability through partnerships with pharmaceutical developers. And Morena is aiming to share his perspective of supplying crucial vaccines, and also how he's been working with the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing, which we've seen in the news over the past couple of weeks. So thank you all again to our panelists that have joined us here today. So to start our conversation, before we dive into how we're supplying all these vaccines, we first wanted to kind of take a look at where we're at from a supply perspective overall in the vaccination effort. And so 2 graphics, a little bit of an eye chart here, but pictorially you can kind of see what's going on. So the one on the left, we have the number of doses of COVID-19 vaccines administered per 100 people worldwide. And what you can see is that there's vastly different perspectives on how this vaccination effort is going, depending on which country's perspective you're looking from. So in the UK and the US, 2 countries where they're beginning to approach near 50% vaccination, the idea of herd immunity is maybe not that distant of a concept, but for a lot of the remaining 219 countries and territories in the world that are facing this pandemic and have positive cases, it can be far from that. And so there's a lot of countries that you see are single-digit percentage vaccinated. And as we note at the top, nearly 30 countries have not received a single dose of vaccine yet. And this is a global problem. That's not just a regional problem, mainly because of the fact that as long as we have areas of the world that have low levels of vaccination, first, we're leaving areas of the world with huge human suffering problems, but also we're leaving potential reservoirs for escape mutants to arise, and that could undermine the vaccination efforts in all the countries. So again, this is a shared problem and one that we aim to address with the vaccine supply. So the last slide, kind of as an overview before we dive into some of the specific details, is just a simple chart that I've put together, kind of thinking of like a subway map or an airline orientation map in the airport, orienting you to where you are. And in this case, we've got this red dot like you'll see on a lot of those maps. You are here, but you in this case is all of us globally. And we have our destination we'd like to reach, which is the end of the pandemic, and we're coming from a prolonged pandemic. And there's factors that can pull us from a vaccine supply perspective, either toward the end of the pandemic or hold us back and make us regress toward a prolonged pandemic. And so these are all categories of topics that we aim to talk about a little bit today. So on the positives, things that are pulling us toward the end of the pandemic, we have the good fortune of having multiple technology platforms that are showing efficacy in their clinical trials and in their emergency use authorization, where we have the mRNA platforms, the adenovirus platforms, protein subunit platforms, all making tremendous progress coming forward in terms of being an effective vaccine. We also have the fact that a lot of these technologies were developed faster than many of us ever thought possible. I can say for myself, if you would have told me 5 or 10 years ago that we could have done what was done in the time frame that happened, I really would have thought it would have been at least twice that amount of time. And so these are all positives that are pulling us toward the end of the pandemic. Cooperative agreements. Morena is going to talk about the cooperative agreement in the African Union, where countries working together can have a bigger impact than the sum of their parts. And this could really help us out quite a bit. But then we do have some items that have both pros and cons, and so strong national efforts. In the news over this past week or so, a lot of the focus has been on India. We've obviously had focus on the US, where You have the positive of governments getting behind manufacturing and vaccine supply efforts and helping to streamline raw material delivery, helping to build capacity, which is all positive, but then at the same time, limit the accessibility of those materials and those vaccines produced outside of their borders, which can hold us back from a global perspective. Manufacturing IP and trade secrets, Arti is going to talk a lot more about this, but this is a key area where, again, we have the good parts of IP where it incentivizes investment and looking after and looking into new technologies. But then at the same time, protecting those trade secrets and IP limits the ability to share that knowledge and benefit more broadly. And then we have a couple of areas that definitely pull on our ability to meet the needs of supply and ending this pandemic. So, vaccine cost comes into play for low and middle income countries. Some of these new technologies like the mRNA technologies are more expensive to produce and sell than some of the traditional vaccines. And so that impacts the ability to reach large populations. We have supply constraints, the availability of raw materials, manufacturing facilities, know-how. All of these have limited the ability to supply the vaccine at the desired quantities. And then distribution challenges, both policy related in terms of how vaccines are distributed, but also these vaccines all have either frozen or cold chain requirements. And so that can cause some challenges as you're trying to distribute it to, again, the 219 countries and territories throughout the world that have been impacted. And then we're all aware of vaccine hesitancy with many different reasons and causes behind it, but a negative impact on getting to the end of the pandemic. So with that, we're going to start diving into our topics of interest. And Dr. Krishna Prasad is going to kick us off with technology platforms that are utilized for supplying these vaccines and some of the relative pros, cons, and constraints. So Krishna?
Yeah, thank you, Matt, for the introduction. It's a really privilege to be part of this discussion. So what in the first slide, what you can see is the various vaccine platforms, most of which have been approved for emergency use, and then one approval is expected. So in my section, what I would like to focus on is the bird's eye view of the technologies that have percolated up, even though there have been efforts in terms of number of vaccine platforms that are being developed. But so these are the 4 main vaccine platforms that have percolated to the top. So in the center of the slide, what you can see is the SARS-CoV-2, which is an enveloped virus with a single stranded RNA genome. So the virus encodes 4 structural proteins, including the spike protein S, as well as the E, M, and N proteins. The spike protein, which you see is like a black flower one with the red label, is the one which triggers the viral replication and then causes infection leading to the COVID-19 vaccine disease. Most of the current vaccines are designed to generate a potent immune response and produce the protective neutralizing antibodies. And the goal of all these vaccines also is to generate a T-cell immune response, to have a long-lasting immune response to kill the cells that are infected by the virus. So if we go from the anti-clockwise on the right-hand side, you can see one approach of using inactivated virus or killed virus by heat or chemical approaches or radiation. So essentially, it's a dead virus of the whole virion, and that instructs the immune system to mount a defensive reaction against the infection. And there are many countries and many manufacturers, and this falls into the traditional category, like Matt mentioned before. There are a couple of companies in China which already have distributed to many countries. And then Bharat Biotech Covaxin also belongs to this platform. And if you go anti-clockwise, the next one is the protein and peptide subunit vaccines. So this basically uses the fully formed spike protein, which is delivered with another adjuvant. So the purpose of the adjuvant is to increasing the neutralizing antibodies to have a long-lasting immune response. which helps to stimulate the immune system of the vaccinated individuals. And Novavax is one example. It is likely to be approved pretty soon. And going on the left side, on the virus, you can see that the mRNA vaccine platform, which is a new technology which has rapidly came to the forefront, which is a relatively new platform, but it is based on decades of work, and then which took advantage of this pandemic, and then percolated to the top. And then we have heard about Moderna and the Pfizer and BioNTech. So it uses the genetic instruction, the mRNA, that allows the vaccinated individuals to produce the spike protein, and it is encapsulated within the lipid nanoparticle to deliver the genetic instructions. And at the bottom, what we have are the viral vector vaccines, which is not totally new. The technology has been there for a while, and then during the Ebola virus crisis, this came to the top. And then this is a hollow shell of a, for example, a common cold virus. And then this non-replicating virus that delivers the genetic instructions to allow the vaccinated individuals to produce the spike protein. Johnson & Johnson and the Oxford AstraZeneca, which is called Covishield in India, and the Sputnik vaccine developed in Russia are the examples of that. Can you go to the next slide? So basically, I would like to go very quickly. Basically, what I'm trying to do is to give a very high level overview to get to the next speaker, so for them to, when they speak, it provides a context. So we talked about the mRNA vaccine platform, and then basically it uses the encapsulated, the lipid nanoparticle, which is important to maintain the stability of the mRNA, which the stability part of it has been technology worked on the stability of the platform, as well as the delivering the mRNA to the cell, and the lipid nanoparticle is needed to enter the cell, and then it produces the spike proteins, which generates the antibodies to generate an immune response. If you go to the next slide. So this is the adenovirus vaccine platform. So this is like the Trojan horse approach, which uses the hollow shell as the carrier protein. So the adenovirus vector delivers the DNA code, and our bodies read the DNA code and create a protein similar to the spike protein. So the vector interacts with the target cells and then insert the genetic instructions, and the cellular enzymes generate the spike protein, which generates the antibodies. If you go to the next slide. So this is the process for production of it involves production of the whole protein. And this technology has been there for a number of years, and then it has been used. It uses, for example, the examples are flu virus, human papilloma virus, shingles vaccine, and so on and so forth. And then it uses the rectangular shape that you can see in the center is an adjuvant that is added to the spike protein. It increases the neutralizing antibodies. The purpose of it is to increase the neutralizing antibodies and have a long-lasting memory B cells, which enhances the production of helping the T cells also to produce the antibodies. So the next slide actually gives a landscape overview of and comparison. So it's very hard actually to discuss the pros and cons, but it all depends on the perspective. And then the protein subunit and inactivated virus belong to the traditional category, like Matt mentioned, and the mRNA and adenovirus are more recent ones. So in the second row, you can see that the adjuvant is added to the protein subunit and inactivated virus. That helps in the dose pairing in the later generation vaccines, or reduce the amount of the actual protein that could be added to generate the vaccine. Whereas the mRNA and adenovirus are kind of considered as self-adjuvanting. And in terms of the number of doses, most of these use 2 doses, except for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which uses single dose. which is a huge advantage for certain populations where, especially where you don't expect those populations to come back, older individuals or certain populations, or it's actually an advantage in some countries to give one vaccination, you're done with. So in terms of the efficacy, we all know that all these platforms do prevent deaths and then do prevent severe disease and hospitalization in adults. So now we are actually moving beyond prevention of the severe disease. And then also the main goal is to prevent transmission, because the infection happens through the mucosal membrane, which is the first line of attack. So if we prevent transmission, and then we can see that we can reduce the disease even further as the second waves are increasing, for example. So now we have some data from the mRNA vaccines that actually it prevent transmission, and then we still have to wait for the other platforms to see whether actually they can prevent transmission. So the main purpose of all these platforms is actually to reduce the viral load. That way we can reduce the transmission. So the next important question is the durability of the immune response. How long, is the immune, these vaccines, once they are administered, how long they're effective. So there is some data from mRNA platform that at least 6 months or more, the durability of the immune response is, and then we had to wait for the data from the other platforms. But also we have some data right now also, they do generate the T cell immune response. So the T cells are a type of white blood cells, and then that will help in killing the virus infected cells, which is very important. So in terms of the population coverage in the various age groups, infants, adolescents, and different populations like pregnant women and various comorbidities, and certain risk populations. And for example, some platforms may be prone for anaphylaxis and some little higher risk for certain things. And then in terms of the data in adolescents is coming from the mRNA platform, and then we are waiting for others, and we hope that we'll have these for the adolescents and infants very soon. So the importance of the storage and distribution is actually, a main part of the discussion as we go along. So whereas the mRNA platform has certain limitation in terms of the downstream distribution, even in developed countries, if you have a frozen temperature, where it has to be held at frozen temperature and distributed at frozen temperature, whereas all the other platforms use the refrigerated temperatures, which makes it easy to distribute. So in terms of the speed to the launch, the mRNA platform has shown to be the fastest. So if there is a new mutation, it's easier to get to the new platform. And then the others are slightly slower. So in terms of the cost, as Matt mentioned, the mRNA platform is slightly high, and the adenovirus platform is less than $4, and it has shown it could be produced in many countries, and that's the advantage. And the inactivated, of course, will be the advantage. So in terms of the access of the technology, Arti will discuss in terms of what are the challenges with the new technology. So in terms of the speed to the next generation vaccines, if it is a single antigen type of vaccine, and then this seems to be the way to go for the mRNA vaccines. If there's a new mutation, it will be the fastest to get to the market. So now I will turn over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Krishna. So our next speaker is Arti Rai, who will be talking to us about the IP and vaccine landscape.
Thanks very much. It's a delight to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about what are some controversial issues that are no doubt being discussed in Washington, D.C. and Geneva, even as we speak. These are the intellectual property issues relevant to the manufacturing of vaccines, and we've already alluded to these questions. So the first slide shows what some of you may have seen already, a request for a waiver of intellectual property, or they talk specifically about certain provisions of the so-called TRIPS agreement. The TRIPS agreement is an agreement that basically sets a minimum standard for intellectual property protection across almost all countries. And so WTO members specifically. So this communication from India and South Africa, which was submitted in October of 2020, requests a waiver be granted to WTO members so they don't have to implement. They can implement, but they don't have to implement or enforce obligations that are IP obligations related to COVID-19 products and technologies. So the request for the waiver is pretty broad. It reaches across a large number of products and technologies. We're going to focus on vaccines and vaccine manufacturing specifically today, however. So the request for waiver covers copyright, industrial design, patents, and trade secrets, because those are the full complement of intellectual property rights one can have under the TRIPS agreement. The lion's share of the public attention, as you probably know, has been on the so-called patent waiver, and sometimes this is called the so-called patent waiver or the patent waiver. And that focus is understandable to some extent, given the history of how patents have played out in prior contexts, particularly HIV/AIDS. In that context, specifically, patents were a key piece of the struggle with respect to manufacturing in countries where there wasn't a patent license. And in point of fact, there were even lawsuits, and the issues were quite fraught for a significant amount of time through the 90s and early aughts. More recently, there has been some concern that the patenting of the human papillomavirus vaccine has played a role in limiting access in low and middle income countries. So these issues it's understandable that there would be a fair amount of concern about patents. That said, I think it's not entirely clear that patents are the key issue. There are a lot of patents, and as I'll show you in a moment, in particular, as Dr. Prasad mentioned, perhaps not surprisingly, on the new kid on the block, as it were, the mRNA platform, there are a lot of patents there, and a lot of the mapping has revealed just how many, and on the delivery mechanism in particular. So again, we can see why this would all be a concern. On the other hand, we do have the pharmaceutical companies saying at least some of them have pledged not to enforce their patents, and Moderna has pledged not to do so during the period of time that the COVID-19 situation remains a pandemic. AstraZeneca has licensed some of its patents, as far as we can tell, fairly liberally. So the pharma companies, or the biopharma companies, are saying that this is not really an issue. And I think that's right. I can see where they're coming from as well. I think the real issue is actually that the patents don't give the intellectual property that's necessary. So I will talk towards the end of my presentation about how patents, which are supposed to disclose the relevant intellectual property, actually don't. And so patents end up being a little bit of a sideshow, I think, in this particular debate. And the main event is trade secrecy. So next slide, please. So here I've noted the full complement of intellectual property rights that can go into trade secret, the arrows that can go into the quiver, if you will. As I mentioned, trade secrecy is the key issue in my estimation here. And trade secrecy can consist in general both of explicit or codified knowledge that's written down but kept secret for commercial/proprietary reasons, or it can be so-called tacit knowledge that's only really found in the brains of skilled scientists and technicians, and it can't necessarily be written down, so it's secret and almost by definition trade secret unless you have that scientist or technician working with you, and she or he is voluntarily working with you. So it's a really hard puzzle to make one's way through, the trade secrecy puzzle, much harder, I think, than the patent puzzle. Now, some of the explicit knowledge could be potentially in the hands of regulators because they do get some of the trade secret knowledge, the part that can be made explicit in regulatory submissions. So to the extent that certain regulators have access or have this knowledge because of regulatory submissions, it could be that what South Africa and India and their a huge number of other countries that are in agreement with South Africa and India are asking for is basically for their regulators to be allowed to disclose whatever information they have. That could be what's going on. That could be a real bone of contention that I haven't seen discussed publicly as much as perhaps it should be. Is that what is the real concern, that regulators would be free to essentially divulge all the trade secret information they may have as a consequence of regulatory submissions? But again, that is a very interesting question. There would also be domestic laws that the regulators would have to take into account, because recall that TRIPS and a TRIPS waiver only goes to the international question. It doesn't go to the domestic laws, and nothing in the TRIPS waiver request compels a country to do anything. It just says that the international framework is waived for a period of time. So that's the explicit information. Then, of course, there's the tacit knowledge. And here, I think that there's a good argument to be made, certainly in the commercial context, that the only way that tacit knowledge really gets transferred is through voluntary agreements, often patent licensing agreements, where the trade secret knowledge that's tacit kind of comes along with the collaborative work that takes place in the patent licensing agreement. And in fact, I've written quite a bit about this in the commercial context. So have a lot of our Duke colleagues. There's a book called Markets for Technology, which talks about how patents facilitate the transfer of trade secret knowledge. And so I can see where the pharmaceutical companies are coming from in terms of saying that patents don't inhibit knowledge transfer, they can facilitate it. But I think in the main, that's happened in commercial contexts where you've got patent royalties kind of greasing the wheels of all of that tacit knowledge transfer. And here, I'm not sure the strong incentives of money would be at play in quite the same way. So, so that's the IP puzzle in a nutshell. I think it's all about trade secrecy, and it's hard to discuss because trade secrecy is, by definition, much more secret than patents. Now, you might ask, why is it that there's so many patents out there and yet there's still also so much trade secrecy? So next slide, please. There are lots of patents. This is just a landscape that I'll go through very quickly, done by Cecilia Martin and Drew Lowry of a commercial firm called Global Prior Art Inc. that they published in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, last year. And you can see that the number of patents on the mRNA platform in particular has increased dramatically in the last few years. And if you look at that last row in terms of the delivery system, the number of patents has really increased. And yet we hear, and I think rightly so, that this delivery system is so incredibly complicated to master and so forth. And yet there's so many patents on it. So what's going on here? Patents are supposed to, in principle, show you how to make and use the invention. Next slide, please. So I just throw up one patent for your quick review. This is a patent that was the subject of a challenge actually by Moderna. Moderna doesn't own this particular patent, so it wanted to challenge it because it was concerned this patent might block it. It's on delivery systems, deliberate formulations for nucleic acid delivery. And one would think that at the end of the day would tell you a fair amount. Well, I've been told by folks who actually are people having ordinary skill in the art, who would presumably be the audience for this patent, that it doesn't actually reveal that much. And at the end of the day, a lot of the information is either explicit trade secret or tacit trade secret information. The other thing that happens with these patents, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah. Is that they claim very broadly. So they certainly don't enable, to use a term of art in patent law, the full scope of what is claimed. So the patents are out there, they're broad, they don't reveal much. And that may also create sort of a climate of fear and concern. But at the end of the day, I still think that the key bone of contention is trade secrecy, and whether it's explicitly codified, for example, in a regulatory submission or just in the brain of a scientist. That's what we need to figure out how to transfer and ideally make less secret in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Archie. And so now we're going to move on to Andrea Taylor and Dr. Moreno, who is going to walk us through the global considerations for vaccine supply.
Great, thanks, Matt. So I'll kick us off just quickly going over some data about the manufacturing landscape for COVID-19 vaccines globally. And so we have been collecting publicly available data on both the purchase and the manufacture of COVID-19 vaccines since about September. We made it public in November. And you can go to our website, which I think is on the next slide. We'll get there in a second. Launch and Scale Faster /COVID-19 to see our analysis and access the data and see the data visualizations, again, for both purchases and manufacturing. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the data that we have analyzed around the global manufacturing landscape, just to give a bigger picture of kind of what's going on, what's there, and where some of the bottlenecks may be. So essentially, the production, we know production absolutely will scale exponentially this year. We don't know how fast it will scale or to what degree. What you see there in the waterfall chart on the left is a sum of all of the projections that have come from the vaccine makers in terms of what they believe their 2021 output of COVID-19 vaccines is going to be. The purple bar on the left are the vaccines that are all on the market already in at least one or more markets. And then the smaller kind of bar above it, the dark blue bar, are vaccines that are not yet on the market, but expected to come to the market in 2021. And then on the right, you see the world population. So you can see that if the vaccine makers' projections are correct in terms of their 2021 production, actually, we could potentially have enough doses by the end of this year to reach 70% of the world's population, which is our best guess in terms of the target for herd immunity. However, I want to caveat this by saying we think these projections are wildly optimistic. We have seen the vaccine makers make optimistic projections and then walk them back, make them again, walk them back. We are seeing now the vaccine makers starting to walk back their kind of third round of optimistic projections for 2021. So we think these numbers are likely to get scaled down somewhat. The scale will still be phenomenal in terms of the ramp up of production this year, but it probably won't be as large as what they have projected. It's important to note, though, that there are some key bottlenecks that are slowing down production. So one of those that we are hearing a lot about right now is the lack of consumables and raw materials needed for the production of vaccines. So these are things like filters and bags for bioreactors. There just are not enough of those being produced. There are not enough of those getting kind of through export controls and export restrictions to manufacturing centers around the world. And that it means that we are not using all of the production capacity that we have globally that's ready to go and online to make COVID-19 vaccines. We also know that export restrictions mean that many of the doses that are projected to be produced in 2021 will not be distributed evenly across the world. Many of them will stay exactly in the country where they were produced. And we are unlikely to see kind of an even 70% coverage around the world. We also know that we are likely to be looking at the need for boosters, either or both boosters that are targeting variants of concern and or boosters that boost immunity that may wane after 12 months or so. So the need for boosters could exacerbate inequalities. The manufacturing capacity that is currently serving high-income countries that we have all been hoping will then be able to transition to serving other markets around the world sometime in late summer may actually be pulled back to high-income countries to produce boosters. So one key point to make here is that the location of manufacturing really, really matters. Owning the production is key to supply, which is a point that some of the other panelists have made as well. And Dr. Moreno will talk about again in a few minutes. It's also important to note that in that purple bar, if you go to our website, you can hover over and see which projections make that up. But it's important to note that it's not evenly divided across the vaccine makers. So actually, there are a couple of vaccines that account for the majority of that supply, and those are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And then Sinovac might give them also a run for their money. They are also really scaling up their production quite quickly. So those three vaccines really make up a lot of the supply that we expect to see in 2021. Next slide, please. So just looking quickly at the manufacturing landscape. So we've mapped the manufacturers as far as we can identify them for each of the vaccines that are on the market or expected to come to market in 2021. And they fall along a spectrum with two distinct clusters. So what we're calling the distributed approach and the centralized approach. So the distributed approach on the left, this is what's showing there are the manufacturing locations for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a great example of the distributed approach. They set up vaccine manufacturing in multiple continents, multiple regions, multiple countries, and they did that through licensing their technology. And so they are manufacturing the vaccine all over the world. They are also, it's matching also their distribution strategy and priorities. They're also distributing the vaccine all over the world. On the right, you see an example of the centralized approach, which this is showing the Moderna vaccine. And they have taken a very different approach, which is keeping the manufacturing very centralized primarily in the US and in Europe. And that also, incidentally, largely correlates with the distribution strategy as well. It's important to note that this has a lot to do with the vaccine platform, which Krishna spoke about earlier, and the sort of the manufacturers around the world who are ready and able to make different types of vaccine platforms influences whether vaccine makers take a distributed or a centralized approach as well. Next slide, please. Great, and just a quick note on the role of middle income countries, both upper middle and lower middle income countries is huge. They're playing a really important role in vaccine development and manufacturing all of the time, pre-pandemic as well as in the pandemic, and specifically with COVID-19 vaccines. And just wanted to quickly mention, so right here this is showing the manufacturing locations for two vaccines that were actually developed by middle income countries. So Sinovac in China is on the left, and it shows it's also being manufactured in middle income countries around the world. And then on the right is Sputnik V, come from Russia, also being manufactured in middle income countries around the world. And then of course, India is another major player, which is manufacturing many of the vaccines, and including Oxford AstraZeneca and Novavax, as well as Bharat Biotech's vaccine, as well as Sputnik and several others. So the manufacturing capacity of middle income countries is really, really critical to the production of vaccines. It's also, we can see by looking at the distribution of vaccines and the implementation of vaccines, it's also really critical to equitable distribution and making sure that vaccines do get to low middle income countries. Unfortunately, we know that the manufacturing in low middle income countries is largely it has been constrained, again, by the lack of raw materials, the lack of consumables. And so we are not, while we have a lot of capacity ready to go and a lot of the manufacturing licenses are in place, but the manufacturing has not been able to happen at capacity because of bottlenecks in terms of getting all the supplies that are needed. I think I am going to turn it over to Dr. Marina to talk us through some more specifics about manufacturing in low middle income countries.
Thank you, Andrea, and thanks to the conveners of this webinar for inviting me. I think following on from what Andrea has shown, she's shown COVID-19 vaccine manufacturing hubs. I'd like to take a step back and look at routine vaccine manufacturing hubs. And the reason for me to emphasize the routine vaccine manufacturing hubs is that for us to be able to respond to the next pandemic, we cannot build manufacturing during the pandemic. It has to be built in between pandemics. And so what you're seeing on this slide, on the right of the slide, is that the manufacturing hubs are similar to what Andrea has shown, mainly in the West, and a lot of it also coming out of India and China and everywhere else. Now, it's the blue countries that are on the right, where that are manufacturing, that are actually supplying on a routine basis pediatric vaccines through the likes of UNICEF and Gavi to the countries that are on the left. So you can see that there is, the blue that is on the left versus the blue that's on the right. It's really contradictory. And so how does that happen? Maybe for some of us that don't know how the global procurement works from a pediatric perspective for low and middle income country, UNICEF and Gavi and WHO raise funds for the least developed countries. And the least developed countries are the ones that are marked in blue on the left. And so those countries are donor funded. But those supplies of those vaccines through the procurement that UNICEF and Gavi and all of those run are coming from the countries in blue. In actual fact, the slide on the blue is probably not even a great presentation in terms of the volume. In actual fact, the large volumes are coming out of one country, being in India. And that is by far the largest suppliers into the Gavi countries that are, that are mainly the countries that are reflected on the left. And so should this situation continue, then, we'll get to have the next pandemic and not having this issue addressed. I think Andrea mentioned issues like the lack of raw material supplies, but also it's quite clear that there is inequitable manufacturing. So whilst there's inequitable access to vaccines, there's also inequitable access, there's inequitable distribution of manufacture. And so the continent that I'd like to focus on, that perhaps many of you, obviously know about, but I'd just like to maybe hone in. Firstly, it's my home continent, but also it's a continent that is now waking up to the fact that it is the continent that has the least manufacturing is Africa. So if we go to the next slide, that the African Union is a body that is similar to the European Union, where all African countries come together and all the heads of states come together once a year. So what has happened in the past couple of weeks, or maybe let me start by saying during the COVID-19 pandemic, even prior to vaccines being made available, the African Union has been trying to get PPEs and trying to have pooled procurement where Africa can purchase on a pooled basis. As the vaccines have become available, and with the lack of other companies being reluctant to do tech transfers, the African Union, through what is called the Africa CDC, have last week come up with a new formation that is called the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing. And this was unveiled last week after many years, after many months and weeks of trying to see how can Africa be self-sustainable. And whilst it won't hit the mark now, but how do we ensure that Africa has enough vaccine manufacturing in time, starting with the likes of pediatric vaccines. So one of the aims that is there is that there are going to be 5 regional hubs, which is on your top right. And there is some vaccine manufacturing already happening on the continent, in South Africa, and some of it in Senegal, which is on the left. But the aim of this initiative is to at least have 5 manufacturing hubs. Not all African countries can manufacture vaccines, so it's therefore they're going to foster that. We'd rather work in a hub model. As you can see, there's quite a few initiatives that are going to be initiated on the bottom of the slide, where there's going to be finance that's going to be raised, there's going to be tech transfer. But the main message is that Africa has over 1 billion population. The individual countries are not big enough and do not have big enough economies to be able to dictate any future supplies. But as a collective, from a pool procurement perspective, if Africa comes together and representing over 1 billion population, and there's a pool procurement where there's an insistence that if you want to supply Africa, you have to manufacture in Africa. That is essentially the main aim of what this is going to be. And therefore, the slides that I've presented and that Andrea has presented, hopefully in the next 3 to 5 years, there can be a redress. But that redress has to start with routine supplies. You have to get the factories going on a routine basis. We can't just mothball factories as and when. They'll need to keep the warm factories going and then be able to respond during the pandemic. So this is really a medium to long-term plan, having been, having COVID-19, unfortunately, being a reminder. But as they say, it's never too late. And that's where I'll end my presentation. Over.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for the great presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides, and we should all start our videos if you guys don't mind. And we do have quite a few questions that have come in, and so I'm going to try to, thankfully, we have had them organized. And so I want to have a chance to walk through these. But also, I know that we went a little bit longer than we said, and so we will stay longer if possible to try to get through these different questions. And so the opening question that we have is for everyone here, and the critical question is, how rapidly can manufacturing of vaccines be globalized? We need low and middle income nations to be able to manufacture disease ASAP. So maybe Morena, I mean, since you had kind of just walked us through at a high level that, I mean, what are some of the, maybe you could take another moment just to kind of give us a little punch list of what goes on in your mind each day as you're thinking of how can you augment and build the manufacturing capacity that you were just talking about.
Yeah, so I think it's important that we know that manufacturing does not exist on its own. There needs to be an ecosystem, there needs to be a skills base, there needs to be infrastructure. So I think that's important to recognize that, if a country does not have that, you can't even start. In the short term, I think the facilities that are on the continent, particularly in South Africa, being my organization and also another organization in South Africa, are at least trying to plug the gap from a full finish perspective. We cannot go into drug substance because we are not in drug substance in the short term. So we cannot respond from a drug substance perspective. But in the medium to long term, not only is the African Union one of the things that are going to respond, but the WHO has also, I think on Friday, took out a call for proposal for a hub and spoke model on mRNA vaccines. And so those are type of innovative models that we need to see, that for the next time we can be able to rapidly deploy manufacture. But in the short term, unfortunately, drug substance is not possible on our continent.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. So kind of making a transition over from the manufacturing side to the very related issue of intellectual property, we received a lot of questions around intellectual property and basically getting the technology and the know-how into manufacturing facilities, especially distributed manufacturing facilities. So I think, Artie, you answered a lot of the questions on the fly, but there's a lot of questions overall about compelling countries to release information, as you had briefly mentioned. And so maybe you could walk us through that also from the perspective of the companies and entities that have generated that intellectual property.
Right. So I talked a lot about the TRIPS waiver, but that's just a first step. That just means that you're not in violation of international law if you decide to waive trade secrets. Then you've got every country has domestic laws typically that protect trade secrets. And the question then becomes, what do you do with those domestic laws? And I can walk through the United States a little bit because that's the country I know best, and it may be the country where there is at least a fair amount of trade secret information housed by companies that are located in the United States. So the issue of whether that trade secret information as a domestic law matter could be disclosed is a really tricky one, because we do have something. If the trade secret information is housed not only in the agency, in the firm, but also in the FDA, we have something called the Trade Secrets Act, which really restricts what the FDA can do. Now, that could conceivably be modified, I suppose, and changed in some way, but that might be a pretty heavy lift. Another possibility is something called the Defense Production Act, which conceivably could be used, I've heard talk about this, to subpoena trade secret information from companies, but that would be a very controversial move if the government were to do that. And in principle, the Defense Production Act can only be used for the benefit of the United States. So whether that information could be subpoenaed and then given over to the global south is another issue. All of that, I think, makes one perhaps hope and pray for a voluntary transfers in through some mechanism that would be agreeable to firms that have the trade secret information in question. And obviously, if it's tacit trade secret information, there's no way you could get that transferred other than through voluntary mechanisms.
Yeah, and I think we've got a couple of comments on that of some of the success that's also happened in that area of the voluntary agreements. And Miranda, I think you've even highlighted in your experience some of the voluntary and cooperative agreements you've worked on. And I think my thought on it, and Krishna, you've been involved in vaccine development for a long time, is that to move in these directions and explore these new technologies, you need to have investors be convinced that it's a worthwhile endeavor for them to put their money and focus into developing these technologies. And so I think that's also why at the very beginning of my talk, I kind of showed the double-edged sword of intellectual property, that it helps fuel the innovation that gives us these great new technologies. But at the same time, those investors and entities are expecting to get something in return for their investment. And so it's a difficult situation. I think if you had cases of compelling the release of that information, you could obviously shy away investors from investing in future technologies that we might need in the next pandemic. So
yeah, there's always that tricky balance. Yeah.
Thank you again, Arti. So we also have a question around policy. And so the question comes in, what policy tools do governments have to encourage or compel the transfer of that? I think also you talk about you mentioned about the Defense Production Act, but that we also want to know, how does this impact vaccine coverage in terms of, if we were able to compel some of this transfer over, do you see that having an immediate impact on coverage? And maybe, Andrea, this could be something where we could talk a little bit about the supply as well, of what are the steps along the way to be able to have supply in place from some of these entities if they did get the available intellectual property.
Yeah, do you mean supply? Do you mean could they manufacture in the middle income countries?
Yeah. We've got a lot of questions, so I am combining multiple ones kind of together into a stream of thought. But yeah, if we had the ability to get some of the technology available in terms of the know-how, and we were able to get licensing agreements in place, what are some of the next steps that would happen with being able to actually meet the supply requirements for those populations?
Yeah, so that's for reasons that Dr. Marina explained already. That's probably not a short-term fix. So that's unlikely to help us in the next, for the remainder of 2021. Really, it is really important for us to be looking at investing and not just looking, actually investing in building up that kind of production capacity in low middle income countries and building regional manufacturing hubs around the world so that we aren't caught short like this again. There will be no excuse for this happening a second time, but it isn't likely that sort of releasing those, getting those patents out of the way or getting more licensing agreements in place is going to increase supply anywhere right now, because actually we already have capacity that's ready to go and isn't able to produce vaccines at capacity because they don't have because of these bottlenecks around stuff like fill stores and bags. So what we really need to do is solve for those bottlenecks right now. That's the most pressing. We're very inefficient right now in terms of our production, and we're wasting capacity, which we can't afford to do. So what we need to do is focus on what exactly are those bottlenecks? What are the materials needed? And how can we solve for those bottlenecks? How can we get those materials everywhere they need to go in the world right now so that the manufacturers who are ready to go have the know-how and have the license agreements in place can actually be churning out doses. So I think that's the key priority. I'm not sure if I exactly answered the question there, Matt, but let me know.
So that was a good perspective, and I think that what resonates with me is also the idea of partnerships like those in the African Union, where you can at least coordinate and have groups of entities working in cooperation with each other instead of potentially working in conflict with each other, especially when you have those limited resources.
Right. I think it's worth addressing to just. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, it's fine. Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly say there's quite a bit coming up in the chat around public investment. And that ties in here as well. And I just wanted to mention that public investment does not make something sort of global public good. Public investment comes from a particular government and a particular taxpayer base. And then the good that's produced by that is going to prioritize that government and that taxpayer base, right? So there's an argument that's been made that, like, if something's been supported by public dollars, it should then not sort of be hoarded by a particular country, so to speak. And that's actually, that sort of doesn't play out in real life. So if the US government invested public US dollars in the development and scale up to manufacture a vaccine, the US government is going to ensure that they get priority delivery of that vaccine at the expense of other countries. And that is the same for other countries as well. When public investment goes into something, that government wants the payback for that. It is going to then prioritize that place. It's not going to become a sort of global public good. And so I wanted to emphasize that also has a lot to do with what's going on with the supply constraints right now and why manufacturing is prioritizing certain countries over others at the moment. It is exactly tied into that public investment issue, if that helps.
Thank you. And so I'm going to quickly acknowledge that we did get a couple of questions related to clinical safety data and timing of dosing. Given that our panel's expertise is not focused around clinical data analysis, I'm just going to acknowledge that and say we will not be addressing those questions. But Marina, I was wondering if you might be able to take a stab at a good question that came in around. It's kind of a complex question, but basically asking what is the best option for Africa, since entities such as Gavi, CEPI, Gates deal directly with Western biotech and pharmaceutical companies. How can we increase the opportunity for collaborative work with African scientists?
I think it's a great question, and I mean it's a question that I think ought to be debated even with the donors. So I think firstly, I think it's to acknowledge that there are these philanthropists and these organizations that are at least doing good. I mean, 20-25 years ago, they were not there. So I think we need to acknowledge that they've done a lot of work and they've made vaccines, in particular in low and middle income countries, available. I think the conversation that we need to pose back to them is that a lot of what's happening is epidemiological studies, clinical studies, which are obviously important, as part of the broader science. But I think there are other, areas that can talk to sustainability beyond just doing clinical trials. So Africa is a fertile ground for clinical trials. We have diversity of population, diversity of diseases. So we can recruit quickly. We can churn out data quickly. We can even find variants. And so and I think that needs to be preserved. But the question is, can we go on to other aspects of science, translational science, where some of these donors can look at it, that would be able to make the case more sustainable? So the whole value chain needs to be looked at. So as I said that, when it comes to manufacturing, we have the downstream part, but we don't have the upstream part, which is the drug substance. When it comes to research, we are very good at clinical research on the continent, but maybe not as good as to the translational science and all of that. And I think that's where the conversations need to be had with the Gates and the CEPIs as well. I mean, they're already doing good work, but perhaps there can be other models, that can be looked at and other avenues. And also so that decisions are not made in Seattle or in Geneva, for Africa. How do we make sure that there's a lot more participative work? So I don't have an answer, Matthew, but I certainly have the question myself.
Well, I think that's a great summary of where we've ended at here, that there's not a single answer to any one of these problems. It's going to take a lot of cooperation. It's going to take a lot of look at policy, best practices for working together, and collaboration. And so that was a great summary. And I agree with you. It's an open question, and it's areas that need more focus and attention, not just for our current pandemic, but for future human health needs as well. So I think with that, we can wrap everything up. Thank you very much, both for the panelists, but also we had a very engaged audience that sent us a lot of questions, and it was great to see everybody really getting engaged and diving into the topic. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.